webinar entitled A Guide to Inform Local Efforts to Support and Affirm LGBTQI2S Children, Youth, and Families. This is Nancy Koroloff, and I am speaking on behalf of the Pathways RTC. The Research and Training Center for Pathways to Positive Futures is a research and training center focused on disseminating information and doing research related to the needs and preferences of young adults with serious mental health disabilities. We're very lucky today to have an august group of panelists who are going to support themselves. And if we can go to the title slide, you will see who those folks are. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, or let Jeff introduce them and tell you where they're from, but you can see it there. And just so that you know, you are muted. The audience is muted, will be throughout the webinar. You can ask questions at any time by addressing them to the panelists, and they will answer them at the end of the webinar. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey Poyer.
Thanks, Nancy. Can you hear me fine?
Hear you fine.
Great. So we're actually each going to introduce ourselves, and I'll let Andy start off. Andy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. My name is Andy Hunt, and I'm at SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and I'm a project officer or public health advisor with the Child, Adolescent, and Family branch, and we are the sponsors of the National Workgroup you'll hear more about later. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Sylvia, would you like to go next?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Jeff. My name is Sylvia Fisher, and I work for Health and Human Services in the federal government at the agency called HRSA, Health Resources and Services Administration. I am the Director of Research and Evaluation for this agency, and formerly worked with Andy and others at SAMHSA.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. Jeremy?
Thanks, Jeff, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeremy Long, and I currently work as the Director of Youth Engagement for a nonprofit in Mississippi called Youth Driven Incorporated, where I work with the Mississippi Department of Mental Health on their System of Care project, and as a youth voice for the National Workgroup.
Great, and this is the voice you're hearing now, Jeff Poyer, and I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, where I've been since 2000. And I lead our LGBTQ practice area and a number of our projects focused on LGBT young people and their families. I served as co-editor of a 2012 book, along with Sylvia, Improving Emotional and Behavioral Outcomes for LGBT Youth, a Guide for Professionals. And also have contributed to several other products focused on LGBT youth, including the guide that you're going to hear about during this webinar. And that brings us to our goals. Let's see, there we go. So we have really two goals for this webinar this afternoon, or late morning, early afternoon if you're on the West Coast. The first is we'd like to provide you some information about the National Workgroup to address the needs of children and youth who are LGBTQI2S and their families, which Andy mentioned. And that is, as he noted, the sponsor of the guide that we're going to be talking about, which is really the focus of the webinar, is to talk about the development of that product and some of the content in it, and then to have a discussion about how it can be applied within your communities and your work in various organizations around the country. And before we get started with talking about the work group, which Andy will share more information about, we just wanted to share a few pieces of background information in terms of terminology and concepts, which are also covered in the guide. But since we're using the acronym at this very beginning of the webinar, we want to start off and make sure that these terms and this acronym is clear. So LGBTQI2S, what exactly does that stand for? So the L and the G, lesbian, gay, So as you can see here on this slide, individuals who are emotionally, sexually, and or relationally attracted to the same sex or gender. And as you can see there, we use sex and gender, and we'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide about why we include that and how they're different. Bisexual, individuals who are emotionally, sexually, and or relationally attracted to multiple sexes or genders. Transgender, individuals whose gender identity or expression is different than that typically associated with their assigned sex at birth. And not all individuals who express themselves in ways that is different than we might assume based on their gender identity are identified as transgender. But for those who do, it's important to understand what it means to be transgender, or trans for short, and important population within this larger body of work that we're talking about today. Questioning. So young people or adults who may be questioning and unsure about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Intersex is sort of is not really related to explicitly to gender or sexual orientation, but is more about our physical anatomy, our reproductive sexual anatomy. And for individuals who are intersex or have disorders or differences of sex development, DSD, which is more of the medical diagnosis for this, that population consists of individuals who have that anatomy that does not fit typical definitions of male or female. So one may have a chromosomal structure that's not XX or XY, or may have reproductive anatomy that are partially developed or reflect both a male and female anatomy. And then there's a two-spirit, which is a culturally based identity and expression, and is rooted in the Native American community. It refers to American Indian, Alaskan Native Americans who express their gender, sexual orientation, and sex-gender roles in non-Western ways that are more aligned with their tribal cultural identities. And historically, two-spirit people were very revered, very respected individuals in their communities, and with colonization, it became stigmatized and suppressed. But there's definitely, in the last 10, 20 years, has been a reclaiming of that identity. And so, as part of this larger body of work at SAMHSA and with this guide, we wanted to be sure to acknowledge that as part of the LGBTQ umbrella. So again, just a quick terminology concept review for those of you who may be less familiar with the distinctions here, and we like to make sure that we just cover these two sets of basics, the terms and now these the differences between sex, gender, and sexual orientation, so that everyone who's coming to the webinar is familiar with this given their different backgrounds. So sex is more about our biology. It's about our genitalia, our reproductive organs, our secondary sex characteristics, and if we were in the same room together, I would probably ask you to give me an example of a secondary sex characteristic. One example would be, for example, facial hair, which we typically would attribute with the male sex, but obviously females can have secondary sex characteristics like that as well. Gender is more psychosocial, so it's more about how we define ourselves and also how socially we define what it means to be masculine or feminine. And of course, how we psychologically view our own gender is influenced by what we've learned and what socially, how we conceptualize what it means to be masculine or feminine. So they're interconnected, but there are these two dimensions. And gender sort of spans three areas. It's sort of our identity, our expression, and our attribution. So identity reflecting our inner sense of being male or female, masculine, feminine, and our expression, sort of what we communicate to others and through our behavior, our appearance, how we dress, the activities we engage in. And then attribution, which is how others see and respond to us. So how others view gender. And then finally, sexual orientation is about our emotional, physical, romantic attraction to others. And that's both biological and psychosocial, because it's psychological in the sense that it's how we see ourselves. It's social because it's sort of how we've learned to define what it means to be lesbian or heterosexual or some other term. So it's socially constructed in that way. And as you can see, the importance of this slide is to make the distinction that although these are interconnected and often reflect our identities, they're also separate constructs. And so it's important to keep that in mind because, for example, a young person who may be transgender, they may have a male anatomy, their biology, but express in a female way and see themselves as female in terms of their gender, and view themselves as heterosexual because they're attracted to other males. So even though their biology is male and they're attracted to males, they would still see themselves as heterosexual because of their gender identity. So that, just to point out sort of why these are different but interconnected. And real quickly before I move on to the next slide, just want to point out when we go back to the acronym, you can see sort of how these terms are reflected in the sort of the triangle of the constructs. That intersex is really about our sex and our biology, and LGB is really about our sexual orientation, transgender more about our gender, and then two-spirit is more of a blend of the three. All right, so I'm going to turn it over now to Andy, who's going to talk about the National Workgroup, which developed this guide. If you have any questions or comments, please use the toolbar on your screen that was referenced earlier, and I'll be facilitating those questions with my co-presenters. So Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the work group. We at the Child, Adolescent, and Family Branch within the Center for Mental Health Services at SAMHSA, we're the sponsor of this group. And we put this group together about 6 years ago. Actually, Sylvia Fisher was instrumental in helping our branch to start this group when she was still with us here at SAMHSA. So the purpose of our work group, our intent is primarily focused on informing our branch and the work that we do with children's mental health, also with the realization that the work that we do has a broader impact and could possibly have a broader impact beyond just our small world of grantee community. So it really is to help guide the development of policies and programs, materials, products, other resources. We want to improve the lives of children, youth, and families in systems of care. So the vision that we have, that we've discussed over the years with our work group and kind of developed this as we've gone along in our history of the group, is that we would like to see all LGBTQI2 children and youth and their families live, learn, work, play, thrive, and participate fully in safe, supportive communities where culturally and linguistically competent services and supports are available, accessible, and appropriate. That's a lot of words, but I think we want everyone to be happy. That's the simplest way of putting it. So that's what we work for. And then the next slide, I want to talk a little bit. If we could advance the next slide, there we go. We'll talk a little bit about what we are trying to promote in the work group. So we are trying to promote a public health framework. We have a wide variety of people who are involved in the national work group from different areas of expertise, and everyone pitches together, and we try to cover the whole spectrum of input. So the other thing that we're trying to promote is the acceptance of oneself and others among children, youth, and families within the populations of focus that we have within the systems of care and children's mental health programs that we promote, and then also the larger community. We think it's important to promote mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health and wellness. We try to promote the development of assets-based or strength-based, culturally and linguistically competent services. And we want to have a family-related approach to services so that we're not only focusing on the youth, but also the youth within the context of their family, however they define that. We would like to try to promote the empowerment of youth themselves in guiding the support that they need. Next slide. So those are all the things that we promote within our branch and specifically within this work group around LGBTQI2 youth and their families. Some of the challenges that we realize are out there that we're trying to address. A lack of support from family, cultural, social institutions for LGBT youth. There are consequences of exclusion, stigma, prejudice, and discrimination that we are trying to address. The social inequalities and disparities in healthcare associated with culture, ethnicity, gender identity. These are challenges. Again, probably one of the most important is the potential for at-risk behaviors, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, and unsafe work, unsafe environments, whether it be school, work, or wherever. Those are some of the things that happen as a result of these other challenges. And that we see that there is a kind of a lack of cultural and linguistic competence services for LGBTQI2 youth for them to access services that is going to honor them for who they are. We're also challenged with the just general access to available supports and services, and then general information and resources. So these are the things that we're, the work group has identified as challenges that we're focused on. Next slide. So one of the things that we have been working on for probably the past 2.5 years is what we have come to call a guide for understanding and supporting and affirming LGBTQI2 children, youth, and families. So this is has been a long time in coming. The purpose of this is really to provide specifically our grant communities, but again, we also realize that we're writing it for our grant communities, and we know that a lot of other people will find this helpful. So we hope that whoever finds this will find it useful in helping and working with the LGBT youth that they are working with in whatever capacity. So I want to talk a little bit about the process of developing this this guide. It was initially patterned after what we call the American Indian Alaska Native Culture Card, which is something that I was involved with here at SAMHSA that was an attempt to provide information in a pocket-sized format to non-Indian providers who are going to work in tribal communities. And we wanted to provide something that was a kind of a basic guide of, if you don't know anything else, here's something to get you started. So that was the general concept that was behind this guide. We went through a variety of probably 20 or 30 iterations of content for this, with a number of people contributing in to lesser degree than others, some. But we took a lot of information, talked with a lot of people who are experts in the field, and basically crafted what we are about to show you. And we think that it's useful. One of the things that we wanted to provide was something that had practical information that a provider out in the community who is not familiar with the LGBT world could pick this up and have a better idea than they did before of how to work with youth and families. So there is, if you go to the next slide, we have an opportunity for you to actually take this guide and for your organization to endorse it, to kind of make it your own. So there is a place on the very back of the guide if you download it, there's a little block where you can add your endorsement. So the National Association of School Psychologists was the first organization to endorse this. So they have taken this and spread it out among their constituency and endorsed it. So that's obviously a national organization that's endorsed it. We encourage other national organizations to endorse the guide, or if you're just a local community program, feel free to endorse this. Put your contact information on it. You can use that block in whatever way you want, saying, you know, we are the XYZ agency, and here's our phone number, and you use it with your staff and other people that you work with. So I would encourage you, after you hear about this, at the end, if you're interested in endorsing it, then you know, let us know. We would like to kind of keep track of what organizations are choosing to endorse this and spreading it out among their own networks. So with that, I will hand it back over to Jeff, who's going to lead us through the rest. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I'm just trying to get out of my marker mode and move to advance the slide. Let's see. Result drawings. Seems to not want to be advancing. Oh, there we go. That should do it. There we go. Okay. Learn something new every day. Thank you, Andy. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of what's in the guide. And this slide shows the organization of it. And we've already covered some of the key concepts that are talked about in the guide. And then there's a short section with some myths that we thought were important to include, just to kind of dispel those. We're going to talk about in this webinar the coming out process, which Sylvia will share a bit about, some of the content from the guide on that page. And then we're going to focus on the tips. There's also a section on there on strengths and challenges, which I'll briefly summarize now. But we're going to focus on the tips for supporting children and youth who are LGBTQI2S. And then finally, the last part of the guide is a list of websites for additional resources, and we'll briefly touch on that later on. And I just want to acknowledge, too, that we're really grateful to have Jeremy Long on the phone on the webinar to provide a youth perspective. So Jeremy will be weighing in as he'd like to as we move forward as we talk about the guide. So in terms of the strengths and challenges, as the guide basically points out, you know, that we want to be and should be strength-based and working with LGBTQI2S young people, but of course at the same time also acknowledging that there are challenges that they experience, may struggle with, and that may affect their well-being. Some of the strengths that we note are sort of the factors that can protect them against the risks and foster their well-being. That may be affirming and supportive professionals like yourselves, for those of you who work in child and youth serving settings. It may be supportive peers. Could also be family members and their larger community, including their faith-based community. So those are really important strengths to identify, to understand, to reinforce, and to build for LGBTQI2S young people, because, like any young person, but in particular for this population, because of the challenges that they typically experience, not always, but typically experience in their larger community and in other settings. And so what the types of challenges that they experience, Andy touched on when he described the work group, but you know, there are issues such as abuse, homelessness. We know that 20 to 40% of all youth who are homeless are LGBTQ, and substance use because of coping with the challenges that they may experience because of abuse or bias, discrimination, and then of course self-harm and suicide attempts. And we know from the research that LGBT young people experience higher levels of harassment, victimization, and violence. So the guide lays out some of these challenges, and we're not going to go into the detail of this during this webinar because we really want to get to the tips and also to have some time for Andy and Jeremy to talk about their perspectives, Andy as an ally and Jeremy as a youth, and then open this up for discussion for you all who are on the webinar. And it's just important to note that that multiple sources of bias and discrimination can contribute to more negative outcomes. So young people who are from backgrounds of color, whether they be Black, African American, or Latino, or Asian, who experience racism, or young people who experience issues around poverty and bias because of socioeconomic status, that all that together can compound to create additional challenges for LGBTQI2 young people. And we just need to keep that in mind as we think about those populations that may be of the greatest need. So we're going to move on and talk about the coming out process. I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed colleague, Sylvia Fisher, who's going to share a little bit about what we talk about in the guide around the coming out process. Sylvia?
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everybody. I'd like to discuss some issues around the coming out process that are described and discussed in some detail in our guide that we're sharing with you today. Coming out has become sort of a buzzword and a catchword in general terms, I think, societally. But what is coming out, and really why is it so important to you? Basically, sexual and gender identity are expressed, at early ages, and they're normal parts of development for children and youth. And sexual identity and gender identity and sexual orientation develop in various ways for different youth. And people, for example, who may be born with external male genitalia may identify, for example, as heterosexual women, as was alluded to in the graphic that Jeff shared with you earlier. And the type of coming out process that happens for individuals is individual and unique and should be perceived and also worked, when you work with youth, it should be treated in that way. Coming out refers specifically to the process through which people identify, acknowledge, and decide to share information about their sexual orientation and or their gender identity with others. Transgender people or people who are intersex may refer to this as disclosure. So you may hear the terms coming out, you may hear the terms disclosure, and coming out is a very, very challenging time in the life of any individual. I'm 52 years old and I'm about to say I'm gay. So I have just come out to all of you at the age of 52. Coming out is a regular process that comes about, that happens in the life of a youth and an adult frequently, all the way really through most of your life. And therefore it's something that evolves in different ways in terms of how it's expressed openly to others with whom you share this information, and how it's received by others. If you look at the slide, you'll see that there are many, many arenas in the life of young people: coming out to self, family, community, friends, peers, school, work, and families coming out. All of these are aspects of the coming out process for youth and need to be considered when working with youth and with their families. Coming out also is a time that, if it goes well, is a positive. It gives a youth a positive sense for their future and hope for their future, and allows them to grow effectively and result in a nice sense of belonging in community, in family, etc., and also in LGBTQI2 communities and their associated supports. By contrast, a lack of support increases stress and it puts these young people at risk for negative outcomes that have been discussed earlier, such as substance abuse and homelessness. And this is all documented pretty well in the guide, what the risks are to youth who have very, very challenging coming out issues. What we want to do with this guide is to promote opportunities to promote safe, accepting, and supportive environments that will enhance the well-being of children and youth who do come out. Because fear of rejection, fear of safety, and so forth does inhibit many young people from coming out. They may feel that they will lose their standing with their families or the community that they live in if they do come out. They may feel personally at risk psychologically and physically. They may be in danger of being harmed, and may be in danger also of responding to harm with the potential for self-harm. It should also be understood that coming out may vary by culture, how it's processed, how it's interpreted by others, and the responses that young people receive is somewhat predicated upon the cultural context that they live in. But one of the main rules that we do point out in this guide is that coming out is the youth's choice and not really the provider's. Because disclosing sexual orientation and or the transgender identity of young people without their permission, whether it's intentional or accidental, can be very dangerous to their safety and well-being. In thinking about coming out, it is not a clear step-by-step process, and there are many, many common experiences around coming out, but as I said earlier, every situation is individual and unique. Some young people will question their sexual orientation, or they may question the gender that they were assigned at birth. They may feel uncertain about or rethink assumptions about what they have heard from their community, from society at large about their sexual orientation and or their gender. And they may see themselves in somewhat different ways from what is commonly expected. Exposure to positive role models who are in the community, LGBTQI2, and support from peers and families will allow them to promote self-acceptance and will help them to come out more readily, safely, easily, and with less potential for outside and self-harm. Coming out to family or community, young people are very, very attentive, as we all know, for signs of acceptance in general from those around them. And in the case of these youth, there's a particular need to be safe. And so coming out can be threatening, and there needs to be a sense that there's not going to be a rejection or harm that comes to that individual. Facilitating that process is a very important role for providers once the youth has decided that he or she chooses to come out. That kind of support, working with families to cultivate that type of support, is a big part of what a provider can do to facilitate that coming out process for youth. And there are tips that are provided in the guide that talk about how to do that effectively. Of course, similarly, youth want to be accepted by friends and peers, and they want to be able to be safe and not have a response of bullying or be rejected by their peers. As we all know, there are significantly negative consequences associated with those outcomes associated with bullying and rejection. So if there is work within the peer group of these youth that can help facilitate coming out in a way that is productive, proactive, assets-based, and helps to enhance the youth's ability to come out freely and promote his or her self-acceptance, then this can be promoted by the provider and then in the community, the system of care around that youth. Similarly, we have the same issues that have become very public about, the concerns around what happens in schools when youth have come out and the risks that come to them associated with bullying, and programs that that are available in schools, such as Gay Straight Alliances, offer opportunities for youth to sometimes come out safely and in an accepting environment. So that kind of ability to promote those types of environments is a very good way for systems of care to help support these youth as they come out in these more public ways. Also, naturally, youth come out more and more to their families, and as they come out to their families, the families themselves have to deal with issues around coming out. Certain family members may feel that they are sharing a secret and are not able to share with other family members. They may be concerned about the responses of other family members to their child's or siblings or other family members coming out. And they may need some assistance in navigating how to deal with those situations, that new information, how to maintain appropriate disclose, how to disclose appropriately, how to maintain privacy when it's appropriate. And they may need assistance in working with that as well. So providers working with families can please think about that and consider that in their work with youth. So it's not a one-time event. It is unique to each individual, and there are personal, cultural, and social factors that have an impact and influence this process throughout. And please remember that some youth will come out in some contexts, but not in others. So although you may be a provider and in the private office you're having that open discussion, that youth may leave that office and not be open about their identity. And that's something that needs to be understood. And it's challenging for youth because they have to navigate these various disclosures and coming outs in every arena of their life, and sometimes they have multiple ways of dealing with various aspects of their life. And coming in, coming out, with some people, with others, in certain communities, in certain environments. So the provider is advised to be aware of these difficult and challenging situations and help the youth navigate them. I don't know if, Jeremy, you'd like to add anything here?
I mean, I would just agree that, you know, the coming out process is something that is continually ongoing, and I'll actually talk a little bit about my coming out process when it's my turn to speak, if that's okay.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, you can go to the next slide, please, for tips. So users of the guide are advised to look at the tips that have been well documented in the guide itself, and these should help people who are a little bit less informed about the community. The guide also, although it was designed with providers in mind, it also might be very informative for family members, for the youth themselves. Everyone who is around that youth, including the youth, him or herself, would benefit greatly from having exposure to this guide. But providers in particular need to be aware that they may or may not be very knowledgeable about this topic or the needs of these youth, and that's completely acceptable. It's okay to be not very knowledgeable. That's why this guide was developed. Youth in general understand that they sometimes trust their providers, even if their providers are not terribly informed, and are more than willing to engage those providers and inform them about what their needs are, about what their identity is, about how they like to be referred to, and how the provider can assist them as they navigate through various issues in the care of that provider. Being an ally and supporting young people who are LGBTQI2+ is absolutely essential if you want to support those youth in a way that's meaningful and promote protective factors for these young people. It helps to learn about and work to implement standards of care. There are standards of care described in the tips for guide users, and there are other sources that we have through the children's program that describe and delineate standards of care for working with LGBTQI2+ youth. Creating these welcome, safe environments that are without bias or discrimination is absolutely a very, very good and necessary step, and addressing negative attitudes and behaviors of others and intervening as needed is also essential. It's helpful and important to connect the young people with peers in their supportive settings and seek any kind of opportunity yourself for professional development. There are self-assessment tools out there that you can access to learn more about your understanding where you're coming from with respect to this population of youth, and there are ways to learn with guides like this about the needs, strengths, the resilience that youth who are LGBTQI2+ have and can be captured in a way that helps to promote their growth. It's always useful to state your expectations and your support and make it public so that these youth know that you are going to support them, what information you are going to share or not, and share what will be held in confidence, and assure them through words and your behaviors. And I might say that many youth in this situation are very sensitive to being aware when there is a lack of acceptance or a lack of support or intervention on their behalf. So by behaving in a way that lets that youth know that you're there for him or her, it will be received and received well. And as I said earlier, young people will ask you for support, but they will also dictate and guide their own coming out process on the timeline that works for them in the terms that they have themselves designated. Examples of appropriate and inclusive language to be used are respectful and acknowledge identity of young people who are LGBTQI2+. Examples would be asking questions such as, are you seeing anyone, rather than questions such as, do you have a boyfriend, or do you have a girlfriend? What name do you prefer to be called? What gender pronoun do you prefer? Asking these questions and having the youth self-identify along all of these arenas and inform you the names that they like, the way they prefer to be referenced, And using that is a respectful acknowledgement of that individual and a respectful acknowledgement that you are there in support of that youth. So those are some of the tips that are in the guide, and I think Jeff will be picking up a few more for us.
Yeah, and we had a question come in about whether we are planning to develop a similar guide for youth specifically on the coming out process. So I just want to put that out there and note that there aren't plans to do that, but there are available resources like that exist. So when we get to the discussion portion of the webinar, I'm going to try to Google that or put in my resource toolkit and pull that up so I can share that with you all before we wrap up. So let me just advance here. Okay, so I'd like to talk about 3 more sets of tips that are in the guide. The first is around symbols. The second around sort of how we think about LGBTQI2 youth experiences relative to the bias they tend to experience. And then the third is involvement of significant others and family members. So first, to start off, as we know in the guide, and as many in the field working to improve services and outcomes for LGBT youth advocate for, it's important to identify and, well, really to create first safe spaces and then to identify those. And as Sylvia noted, that can also be really valuable and an asset during the coming out process. So, how to do that? One can show symbols such as the 2 that we have here. The one on the top, the System of Care rainbow logo, something that the National Workgroup developed a few years ago. We took the standard System of Care logo and put a rainbow backdrop on it and distributed that to System of Care communities. We also created stickers through that. Rainbow flags and other messages and images such as this Glisten Safe Space sign. The National Association of School Psychologists, NASP, also has several signages that it has created and disseminated to identify safe spaces and to address bullying and harassment of students from different backgrounds, really sort of reaffirming school support of diversity. So these signs, and these symbols, which can also include, images of diverse families, same-sex headed families. They could also include images of positive role models from the field. There have been several stories lately in the media about baseball players or other sports players coming out as gay, and it's important to think about how you can include that as using pictures of those athletes, of those individuals who may be role models for your young people, how to use that as a way of identifying safe spaces and showing that you're trying to be inclusive. And we can't understate that young people are going to recognize that these symbols typically, and they will turn to those places to maybe reach out and to seek a safe environment to be themselves. So that's why it's important to not only display these symbols, but also to work with the staff and the individuals in those settings to make sure that they are in fact safe places, because that could actually do more harm than good if a place is signaled as a safe place, but in fact is not safe. One other way to in this sort of how we display things in human service systems is to have books and magazines and materials that are inclusive of the LGBTQ community. And one example is the question that was asked around the coming out process for youth. And there are resources written for youth on the coming out process and what it means to be LGBT that we can share. And of course, creating resource lists which may not be visible in public spaces but are easily accessible to school staff or other staff working with young people. So second tip here is really around acknowledging that acknowledging the connection between bias and the stress that causes to health risks and health risk behavior. Really important to understand that connection, understand the data, and to work to address those biases in ourselves and in those around us, whether it be adults or young people as well. And when working with young people, it's important to let them know that they'll be supported throughout their experience working with you, whether you're a mental health professional or a school professional. And it's important to also be courageous and address those instances of bias, whether explicit or implicit. I just did a training the other day and heard about, a teacher using negative language about a young fourth grader who was gay, and the school mental health professional, said, please don't use that language. That's, offensive, and shared the story of how she had that dialogue with the teacher. Not always easy, but it's important to do, and especially if young people are around you, to be role modeling that and showing that that's not acceptable. And then third here on this slide is really how is encouraging the participation of family members and others in the lives of young people. So of course important to ask for permission, but if you're a school counselor that's counseling or meeting with a young person who may be struggling with their identity, in consultation with that young person involving the family as appropriate, as well as other people that are important in their lives. So the last section of the guide, so we've talked about the guide organization. So we start with the key concepts, and then we go into Mythbusters, coming out, strengths, challenges, and tips. The last section is this page that you see here, and we know you probably can't read it, but just to show you visually kind of how it's organized, we've listed out a number of key websites that we recommend for additional resources, and to help you use this as a tool in your own work, we've identified which topics they tend to focus on. So there's that middle column that has key topics related to youth. So some of these include other topics that are not youth-related, but we kept this focused on those that are youth-related. And then to the right, you'll see that there are places, some of these resources are more tailored for families versus professionals and youth. So we've tried to indicate that so that way you as a user of this guide can access other resources efficiently and ideally get your needs met quickly. Okay, and I'm going to turn this over to Andy, who's going to share an allies and providers perspective, and then we'll hear from Jeremy. So Andy?
Great, thank you, Jeff. So I just wanted to speak a little bit about the, sort of who the intended audience is for this this guide. And one of the things that I was saying to the group as we were going through various iterations, we need to have sort of a person in mind, a type of person in mind that might be reading this. So the person we thought we had in mind was sort of this well-intended, skilled youth service provider of some sort who might find themselves working with their first self-identified LGBTQI2 youth. So this helper has no experience in working with youth and wants to help, but maybe can't really figure out exactly what am I supposed to do? What's the most appropriate way for me to interact with this youth? So there's a desire to help youth, to be supportive, affirming, but maybe not the kind of basic knowledge that that you would have. I think of it in terms of cultural competence. So myself as an ally, as a former clinical social worker who found himself working in this very situation, having a gay young man come to my office and ask for help, and I wasn't exactly sure how I was supposed to deal with that. So he taught me a lot, and if I would have had this guide, I think it would have been very helpful for me at that time, 20, 25 years ago. So let's move to the next slide. Not that far ahead. There we go. So what this does from an ally's perspective, it really provides just some basic information that helps a provider raise their level of self-awareness, which of course is one of the very first things, is to be aware of your own attitudes, understandings, feelings, whatnot of interacting with LGBTQI2 youth and other people. So this really can be a great start for providers to be advocates and and allies. And for myself, not being LGBT, this is a way for me to support something, to support people that I believe in. There are still things that I get confused about and things that I really don't know. And I look to people who know that and will do what I can to support other professionals and the youth for being who they are. And so the resources in this guide can really provide a lot of help and input on just gaining knowledge and knowing some things that you can do as an ally that will help the community. For me, this is I'm very passionate about this just because it's the right thing to do. Everybody has the same rights and should be treated with respect. So this guide can help us as allies to do that, to be more informed. So that's my perspective from an ally, and I will hand it over to Jeremy to talk about the youth perspective.
Thanks, Andy. And I'm going to be posting momentarily in the question and answer section a link to a guide on coming out for youth. Jeremy?
All right, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Andy. Good afternoon, everybody. And I think as you can see by my picture that's on the slideshow, youth voice does matter, and I'm very excited to share some pieces of my story and some recommendations on how best to support LGBTQI2 youth and their families. So I am a multi-system involved youth. When I was 13 years old, I was placed into foster care after experiencing abuse, neglect, and abandonment by both of my biological parents. Many of the stories that you hear from youth who are alumni of the foster care system include multiple placements, educational instability, lack of trust, and a difficult time recognizing and achieving goals. Although I was fortunate in that I only had one placement, I still experienced many of the challenges that exist as a youth in care. All 5 years I was in foster care was spent in a home with someone who identified me as her son and not her foster kid, who was there when I was challenged by life and was in a place to offer me opportunities that many youth in care rarely receive. Opportunities included remaining in the same high school all 4 years, having the ability to partake in extracurricular activities, and seek opportunities that would promote a path to success. I entered care at a time when a traditionally raised youth would make the transition from middle school to high school. This allowed for me to have a fresh start, but this didn't come without difficulty. I was starting high school with peers who had grown up together in a past that most wouldn't understand, but with ample support, I marched on headstrong. Having educational stability allowed me to plant seeds and develop friendships and focus on other matters that pertain to my overall well-being. So alongside being involved in the foster care and education systems, I was also involved in the mental health system. Growing up in a home of abuse and neglect usually has a negative impact on the well-being of a young person. Because I was never able to build trusting relationships with adults, this followed me into foster care. I was also a very aggressive teenager due to built-up anger that I really didn't know existed. My foster mom quickly noticed this and gave me the ultimatum either to enter therapy or to find another placement. I quickly accepted her proposal of getting help due to me not wanting to leave a home that was so supportive and caring. And it wasn't long after beginning therapy that I realized how many issues I really had based on my upbringing. My therapist was really able to get down to the grassroots of my anger and trust issues and help me begin resolving them. This allowed for me to begin opening up my heart and establish trust with the ones who loved and cared about me. So even though I knew I was gay around the age of 10, this was a piece of my life that I wasn't able to come to terms with until I was about 21. I grew up with the dream of a wife, 2 kids, an Australian Shepherd, colonial-style house, and the white picket fence, and I always thought that I would never be able to achieve this dream if I had lived the life of a gay man. So like my foster care story, my coming out story was just as positive. The very first person I came out to was a really good friend and coworker of mine. We'd actually gone out to lunch that day, and because I was too nervous to actually speak the words, "I am gay," I opened up the notes application on my phone, wrote, "This is my coming out to you," and handed her the phone. She replied with nothing but happiness and acceptance, which really sparked my movement to continue telling those that I cared about. The one person I was incredibly scared to tell was my mom. I drafted this incredibly long 2-page email telling her that I was gay and that I really hoped nothing would ever change between us. And her very short response back to me was, "I always had an inkling that you were, and trust me, nothing will ever change between us." And this really made me so happy, and from that point onward, I really began living the life of my true identity. So coming out to friends and family was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made, and some youth who build up the courage to come out are greeted with unaccepting and judgmental friends and family, and for even youth in foster care end up becoming unwelcomed in their foster homes, which results in more placements and a lack of trust and love. Any youth, whether system involved or traditionally brought up, deserves the right to a nurturing and supportive environment. Youth in foster care and mental health are already dealing with hardships, making living day-to-day a challenge. And it's our responsibility as service providers to ensure that just because they identify as LGBTQI2S, they shouldn't be treated any differently than a youth who doesn't. When a young person is in an environment that is supportive and nurturing, they are able to focus on other goals, such as completing education, developing healthy peer-to-peer and adult relationships, and begin identifying what their path to success will look like. It is very difficult to turn on the news today and not see at least one story that isn't related to bullying in schools. A young person typically spends 7 or more hours in school per day, which equates to half of their waking hours. School is also an environment where they tend to be influenced the most by their peers, teachers, and school faculty. And when a young person feels supported by their peers, it allows them to focus on the more important aspects of their success and not whether they should feel threatened based on their identity. Luckily, these days, there have been mass movements in education around the LGBTQI2S community in schools and bullying prevention campaigns, but there are still so many stories that continually go unnoticed. And it's really imperative that us as service providers, we offer a welcoming environment for our young people to communicate freely with us, then connect them with the resources that are available to empower them to embrace their true identities. And one of these resources is this guide, which can be used by service providers, children, young adults and their families, community partners, and allies. This guide is really a wonderful resource when working with youth and families who want to support identifying youth. When I talk about this community and mention the acronym LGBTQI2S, I am consistently confronted with the question of what certain letters stand for. And I've realized that depending on the community that I'm working with, the letters of the acronym may not be used or may have different definitions for that term. And I really feel that education is very important when it comes to any community, especially this one. And as service providers, it is important that we talk consistently, resulting in less confusion when translating this language for our youth. So not only does this guide provide a framework for a consistent theme nationwide, it also provides a guide for young people who may not feel comfortable requesting this information from their providers. And as we know, the coming out process and supports necessary to provide a nurturing environment are going to look completely different for every young person that we work with. But having this guide available promotes increased effective communication when discussing supports for LGBTQI2S youth and their families. Another piece of this guide that I really hope our families and youth find useful is the resources listed. So more often than not, when talking with communities, a question they pose is what types of resources and information exist to help us help our young people. And this guide really provides many websites and resources that can be utilized by supporters, youth, and their families. So I encourage you guys to use this guide as both an educational tool and a resource handout for youth and their families who really want to create a safe space and environment to develop a stronger understanding of a community that so many are involved with. And as a navigator of the child welfare, mental health, education, and LGBTQI2S systems, and a service provider for youth involved with these systems, I really know firsthand the challenges that our young people and families face. Promoting empowerment and education for these young people and their families will really result in a better understanding of what being system involved means and how best they can seek and obtain the resources that will help them be an overall stronger and healthier unit. Sometimes being system involved is the only way our young people and families identify themselves, but it's our responsibility to ensure that they realize they are much more than that. Being system involved is a very small piece of what makes up their overall lives, and in the end, if navigated properly, they will utilize these systems as support networks that translates into being a stronger support network for each other. Being gay, a former foster youth, a recipient of mental health services, and a college graduate are all aspects of my life that I use to encourage other youth and families to realize their potential and begin identifying their dreams and goals and begin taking steps to achieve them. And I'll end with this. I am who I am, and I think it's our duty to allow others to be given the right to tell the world who they are to feel supported and loved. And I want to say thank you, and I think I'll hand it back over to Jeff, who will wrap this up for us.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your powerful story and sharing there. We realize we're at the end of our time and just want to wrap up by encouraging you to use the guide, to disseminate it locally, to talk with families. And we've highlighted here another resource from SAMHSA, which is the Helping Families to Support Their LGBT Children Practitioners Resource Guide. And another way to use this guide and the Families Guide is to facilitate some community dialogues. So to think about how you can bring people together to talk about some of the needs, some of the strengths in your communities, areas for you to be building your cultural competence and working with these young people, and to improve their outcomes. So we've answered a few questions that came in through the chat. Are there any other questions that folks have at this point? And you can raise your hand or type in the chat box before we end. Okay, I don't see anything else coming in. So just want to note that, does anybody from RTC want to comment before we, Nancy?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that everybody knows where to go to see the guide. Did you give a website?
We're going to send the guide to everyone that registered for the webinar. I think you all are going to send it out, and then we'll include the link in there as well.
Okay, great. And this webinar has been recorded and will be on the Pathways website for people who want to go back and hear parts of it. So I think that's it. We want to thank you all for participating. Again, this is a webinar that's sponsored by the Pathways RTC. We hope you'll check out our website where we have lots of other information, reports, tip sheets about working with young adults. Thank you.